when we last spoke, we talked about the Second World War and, in particular, its impact on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we had a situation where the Zionists, the Jews that were already in Palestine, were very frustrated with Britain. Remember, Britain's in control of Palestine. And in Britain in 1939, because they needed to calm stuff down in the region, because the Arabs had been revolting since 1936 against the incoming Jewish populations that had been disenfranchising or increasing property values or taking away jobs from the local Palestinian population. The Arabs were mad in 1936, and so they revolted. Who do they revolt against? The guys in control of Palestine. Those are the British. And the British calmed that down by 1939, but in 1939 we've got another problem that they need to deal with, and that's the growing tensions in Europe in the Second World War. So Britain needs to calm stuff down in Palestine because their number one priority is in Europe. They have to deal with Germany. They can't worry about tensions in Palestine. They can't worry about needing to send more troops into Palestine. So Britain in 1939 issues a second white paper. We talked about this last week. Britain issues a second white paper, and in that white paper, this is a paper on government policy for Britain, it puts for the first time a hard limit on the amount of Jews that can migrate into Palestine. And it says there will be no divided Palestine, but within 10 years there will be a unitary state. So one state for everybody. And Jews can migrate to Palestine still, but only so much that the Jewish population of Palestine will be 1/3 of the total population. So you've got Jews now really angry with Britain. The Arabs were angry with Britain. Now the Jews are going to be angry with Britain because it's the first time that an actual limit on migration to Palestine has been set. All right? And we talked briefly, I mentioned that Jews said that they would, or the Zionists plan to deal with this white paper, but at the same time deal with the threat of Nazi Germany, was to fight the white paper as if there was no war. So to do everything they could do to circumvent these immigration barriers that Britain is setting up. But then also fight the war as if there's no white paper, because the Jews of Palestine and the Jews of the world can't have Germany win, all right? So they're simultaneously doing these two things. So Jews in Palestine and Jews elsewhere would be very supportive, obviously, of the Allied war effort in World War II. But in Palestine, some Jews were actively working to circumvent the restrictions that the British had put on. But for those Jews and for the immigration into Palestine, they would never come close during the war years to the numbers that even the white paper had allowed for. Because when the Holocaust begins in Europe, it becomes increasingly difficult for Jews to escape Palestine, or escape to Palestine. So while the war was being fought, things did calm down in Palestine. The number one thing that was causing the Arab revolt from 1936 to 39 was Jewish migration. And that's what was cut the most during the Second World War. So after the war, now the Zionists don't have to worry about defeating Germany anymore. That's been done. Now they can put their focus on the defeat of that white paper. Now the Zionists' chief enemy becomes the British government. Remember, the Arabs were angry with the British back in 36. Now the Zionists, after the white paper of 39, they're the angry ones. And now that the war is over, they can focus on pushing back against the British rule of Palestine so they can have greater immigration and eventually have a Jewish state. Now I put this map back up on the board here. This was the original British mandate of Palestine. All right? When the mandate system was first created, there were three mandates in the Middle East. There was a Syrian mandate that was going to go to the French. There was an Iraqi mandate that the British would keep an eye on. And then there was a Palestine mandate. And then everything kind of went haywire when the Arabs wanted to have Syria, and they sent in, and Abdullah, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, was taking an army up to Syria, and the British and Winston Churchill put a stop to this, and one of his solutions was to cut this in half, to draw a line down the Jordan River, and say, now this is Palestine, and this is going to become the mandate of Jordan. And eventually down the road, Abdullah will become the first king of an independent Jordan. His brother Faisal will become the first king of an independent Iraq. There is a faction within the Zionist party, or the Zionist movement, called the revisionists. Not to be confused with historical revisionists, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. There's a faction called the revisionists. This is an extreme right-wing Zionist faction that says that Jews or Zionists don't just desire what is Palestine after Winston Churchill draws a line down the Jordan River. Their version of the story says that the Jews should have all of this. So what they want to look at again, what they want to revision, is the line that Winston Churchill drew down the original mandate of Palestine. They say all of this should be Palestine. That not just this, or even not just the parts that Britain was willing to say in that Peel Commission report we talked about last week, would be a Jewish state. They wanted it all. And it's these Zionists, these extreme revisionists, that are the biggest source of violence and protestations against the British rule in Palestine. I want to mention a couple guys' names because they're going to come up later in Israeli history. First, this is Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin is a leader of the revisionists, and he was leader of a paramilitary group called the Irgun, I-R-G-U-N. For our purposes, I think that's in your standards, you might see that word or that name, Begin's name or the Irgun, pop up on an IB document that they give you. Menachem Begin was the leader of this right-wing extremist group. Guys, if it existed today and did the things that they were doing in the 1940s, if they were doing those today, they would be labeled an international terrorist, or not an international terrorist group, they'd be labeled a terrorist group, okay? Irgun was a radical right-wing group led by Menachem Begin. Now, this name is going to be very important because Menachem Begin is eventually going to be a prime minister of Israel. Once there is an Israeli state, Menachem Begin will one day be leading it. And that's what's very interesting about this history of Israel is a lot of the guys, you know how like when the United States was founded, our founding fathers, like the Washington and Jefferson declaring independence and all these dudes, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, and you know how they eventually, down the road, even though some of them were like fighting in the war, doing things at the very beginning, they eventually become presidents, or at least in some ways leaders of the new nation. Well, in many of the same respects, a lot of these Israelis that were active at the founding of their nation, fast forward a few decades, they'll become the leaders of Israel in the 70s and 80s. So Menachem Begin was a leader of a revisionist group called the Irgun, and he started leading attacks with his group against British rule. Another guy whose name we should be familiar with, Yitzhak Shamir. Yitzhak Shamir, he's again another prime minister of Israel in the future. Yitzhak Shamir was the leader of another radical group called the Stern Gang, S-T-E-R-N, the Stern Gang. And Irgun and the Stern Gang were both active during World War II, fighting against that white paper, trying to allow more Jews to migrate into Palestine. And then after the war, they just turned their attention to the British rule of Palestine. Yes, ma'am? That's him right there. Yitzhak Shamir. Oh, Stern Gang. S-T-E-R-N. Stern Gang. But we're going to make it sound German, so we say Stern Gang. And here he is. He's got a wanted poster because this guy was wanted by the British government. This is a wanted poster by a Palestine police force, but they wanted him because he was the leader of a guy that was causing a lot of trouble for the British. Now, we want to take a moment to talk about the situation of the British after World War II. They're broke, all right? They dealt with the Battle of Britain, the bombing, the London Blitz, right? Their empire is teetering. They can't afford to maintain it anymore. We talked about how at the end of World War II, there's two superpowers, and Great Britain isn't one of them, right? So the British government is broke, its empire is crumbling, and they are no longer in any kind of position to maintain the empire that they once had. The United States is going to start stepping up and taking over that role. We also are going to see in the aftermath of World War II hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees who are going to be liberated from the camps, and they're making their way to the American zone of the occupation of Germany. Because they see getting to the American zone is their easiest way to get out of Europe. And can we all understand why, if the Jews didn't move out of Europe, whether coming to the United States or moving to Palestine or anywhere else, why after 1945 that would be something they'd want to do? Okay? It wasn't only the Nazis that were complicit in the Holocaust. All right? In every country that the Nazis had occupied where they were rounding up Jews, there were local, non-German, non-Nazis that were aiding in the Nazi roundup of the local Jewish population. So Jews of Europe did not feel that this was a safe place to be anymore. And so thousands, 250,000, 250,000 Holocaust survivors will flood into the U.S. zone of occupation. President Harry Truman has got to deal with this, okay? This Germany that's going to try to get back on its feet, it can't deal with 250,000 refugees, right? What are we going to do? And Truman says to the British, hey, why don't we let maybe 100,000 of these guys go to Palestine? The United States can bring some of them over, and many do come to America eventually. But why don't we let a bunch of them go to Palestine? And the British weren't down with this. The British didn't want to allow this 100,000 population of refugees to go into Palestine. Because what would happen in Palestine if 100,000, now this would be far beyond what the White Paper of '39 had allowed for, what would happen in Palestine if 100,000 new Jewish refugees were allowed into the mandate?
They'd have a population beyond what their economy could support.
A population beyond what the economy could support, and what would the Arabs do? The Arabs would revolt. So the British aren't down with this. They say, America, we'll take these 100,000 refugees if you guarantee support to us in light of an Arab revolt. If America will guarantee some military aid if we take these in and the Arabs revolt. The United States says, no, we have bigger fish to fry. What is our primary concern in 45, 46, 47? Soviet Union and Europe, right? Well, what are we going to do with Germany? So we're not going to offer that support. And so Britain says, we're not going to let in 100,000 Jews. And so now the Jews, what started off as relatively small attacks, these groups like Irgun and the Stern Gang begin to escalate their violence against British rule. This is known as the Jewish Uprising. And this is one aspect of the Arab-Israeli conflict that I think a lot of people aren't too familiar with, is the sense that, because today when we think of terrorism in the Middle East, especially terrorism in Israel, we would think about Islamic groups using terror against the state of Israel, right? In the beginning of the state of Israel, it was Jewish groups using terror against British control. And when I say terror, we're not talking about any small thing here. This is the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. This is the King David Hotel. This was blown up by that group called Irgun, led by future Prime Minister Menachem Begin. This is in July of 1946. The King David Hotel in Jerusalem housed some British government mandate offices. 91 people were killed, and a few dozen more were injured in this attack. Britain couldn't handle Palestine anymore. Britain had to recover from its own war in the Second World War, and they couldn't handle this anymore. And so they were very willing by 1946-47 to pass this question of Palestine on to the newly formed United Nations. Hey, this is what the United Nations is made for, to work out international disputes like this. So Britain will pass this problem. It's one of the earliest situations that the new UN is going to deal with. So Britain essentially washes their hands of the Palestine situation because they can't deal with this anymore. And guess what? Those revisionists, those extreme radical willing to murder people to get their political desires met, it worked, right? They blow up a building. Britain says, psh, enough of this, we're going home. Let someone else deal with the problem. it's not hard to see parallels between this story and what's happening in many corners of the Middle East today. So the United Nations is going to take over. And they put together a committee to investigate what we should do with Palestine. And it is called UNSCOP, the UNSCOP Committee. United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. The United Nations is going to deal with this. They put a committee together. The committee, the UNSCOP committee, goes to Palestine. And they talk to Jews in the area. And they talk to Arabs in the area. And they find what either side wants out of the situation. Not surprising, Jews want a state. Not surprising, Arabs want a state. Not surprising, Arabs don't want any Jewish state. Arabs don't want a Jewish state in 1947, just like Arabs didn't want a Jewish state when the British proposed it in 1937. The Arabs would say, hey, if Jews are going to live in an Arab state, fine. But there should be no Jewish state because there was never a Jewish state here unless you're going back a couple thousand years ago, and that is ancient history. So why should any Arabs be displaced by the creation of a Jewish state? So both sides claim they have a justified claim over the land. So the United Nations solution is identical to the solution that most people think would be the solution to the Arab-Israeli problem today. Now, when I say most people like outside of the actual situation would say, well, why don't, like if I were to explain the Arab-Israeli conflict to my children, there's these people and they want to live on the land, and then there's these people and they want to live on the land. Well, what do we teach little kids to do when, like, do people want, like, something? Share. You got to share it. Okay, you get your land and you get your land and everybody will be cool. It's as easy as that for a child, all right? But it's not as easy as that for the United Nations, although they're going to try to create that kind of situation. So what the UNSCOP committee comes up with, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, what they come up with is what we're going to call a partition plan. We already used that word with the British last week when they decided with the Peel Commission, hey, why don't we partition this land? And the Arabs said, no, we're not partitioning anything. We will keep revolting. Well, now the United Nations says partition. And here we have what the UNSCOP committee came up with. The orange would be a Jewish state. So they get lands in the north along the Mediterranean Sea. They get lands in the northeast. They get lands in the south. This is that Negev desert, which is desert, except what does it do? It connects you to that Gulf of Aqaba. It gives you a water access to the Red Sea, just in case Egypt is one day going to not allow Jews to go through the Suez Canal, which is going to happen. All right? And then the Palestinians get what is today most of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and an area in the northeast of the country along the Mediterranean Sea. Does it look good?
No.
Why?
Well, for one, there's going to be a great number of border crossings. You've got a couple exclaves there.
Okay, so you've got a lot of shared borders, and if these people don't like each other very much, which they're not, that's a lot of borderland, roads are going between these that are going to be tough. Oh, I didn't mention, Jerusalem would be an internationally overseen territory where all would be free to go and worship as they saw fit.
As long as you can get there.
As long as you can get there, sure. Any other problems with this?
Well,
Yes.
Well, originally wasn't like the Negev desert given to the Arabs?
Originally, let's look at this. Very good. This was the original British partition idea. And here, I wish the colors were the same, but whatever. The green is what the Arabs were to get. So what happens in a decade to what the Arabs were going to get out of this partition? Much, much less land compared to what they were originally proposed back in 1937. Now, don't get me wrong. What did the Arabs say to this proposal? They didn't like it. They weren't going to go with it because they didn't want any Jewish state. Well, now the Arabs are getting even less out of what the United Nations is going to argue. So the Zionists, they're not thrilled. Because what did the Zionists want? All of it. All of it. And then those far right-wing radical ones that are blowing up buildings in Jerusalem, they wanted even more than that. Like, they didn't want even this stuff or any of that, or maybe even this they wanted. So the Zionists are like, nah, we can deal with it. In fact, the first prime minister of Israel, a guy named David Ben-Gurion, we're going to talk about him in a moment, he is going to say that half of something is better than all of nothing. That makes sense. Like, that's the Jewish perspective. Let's get in and let's get our foot in the door. Let's get something. Where the Arabs, for the Arabs' part, they're just going to resist it outright. No, we don't support this. This is not acceptable. Unfortunately for the Arabs and their desires, they have virtually no say. Because this is the British Mandate of Palestine that has now been handed over to the United Nations to decide what to go with. There was no Arab state before, so they have no Arab state in the years prior to this decision. They have no say in the matter. So the United Nations is committed to partition. The Arab League, which is a collection of nations that are members of the United Nations, like Egypt and Arabia and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq over here, the Arab League says, no, we don't support this. We don't want a Jewish state here. Now, time out for a second. Do you recall when we talked in the Cold War about the non-aligned movement? One of the problems with the non-aligned movement was, even though you had all these countries that you would think would be standing on common ground, they're all motivated by their own self-interests. Same thing with the Arab League. The Arab League doesn't want to see this happen. Or pardon me, Egypt doesn't want to see this happen because Egypt actually wants some of this territory. Egypt wants the Gaza. Jordan doesn't want to see this happen because Jordan doesn't want to see an Arab state at all, or a Jewish state, because they want some of the West Bank. They want this West Bank territory. Syria wants territory up in the north. So all of these Arab League nations, they're going to oppose this partition plan, but not because they're supportive of Palestinians' rights, but because they want chunks of this land themselves. So the Arab League opposes it, but overwhelmingly the United Nations approves it. And the UNSCOP partition plan will be approved in a vote 33-13. So the partition plan is going to go through. There will, according to the United Nations, be 2 states, and it's going to look like this. All right? Let's see how that works out. Immediately upon the passage of the UNSCOP partition plan, both sides begin to arm for a fight. And by November of 1947, a civil war will break out in Palestine.
That's not really civil.
It is, well, I mean, okay, well, we'll call it what we want to. You've got in one entity, in one British Mandate of Palestine, now being overseen in part by the United Nations, the Jews of Palestine and the Arabs of Palestine begin to arm, and in November of 1947, they begin to war against each other. I call it the Civil War. If you want to call it something different, I call it the Civil War portion of this, okay? 2 people in the same entity that are going at each other. The Zionists begin to develop for this fight what is known as their Plan Dalet, or Plan D. Just the letter. The Zionist Plan D calls for the defense of Jewish settlements that they believe will be threatened when a war is going to come. So, for example, as we look back at the map, there are Jewish settlements that are supposed to be within the new Jewish state, according to the United Nations, that might be threatened once a war happens. Like, for example, some Jewish settlements in this area that might one day be invaded by Jordan. So the Zionist Plan D calls for the defense of these settlements. What will happen, though, is many Arab communities that the Zionists feel might be like threatening to the Jewish settlements, many Arab communities will be essentially eliminated. This is the village of Deir Yassin. And in April of 1948, that same Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, that blew up the King David Hotel, now they're taking part in this war with the Palestinians. They will go into the village of Deir Yassin, and estimates range between 100 and possibly 300 civilians will be massacred by this Irgun group. Non-combatants just being killed in this village. This terrifies, this action in Deir Yassin terrifies other Palestinian villagers. And many of them, fearing that the same might happen to their village, pack their bags and leave. They try to escape. They get out. They head further to the east as they're feeling vulnerable. Now, the Arabs, for their part, are also attacking Jewish settlements, and there's car bombings, and there's after this, a Jewish medical convoy was attacked. So there's violence certainly on both sides. By May of 1948, more than 300,000 Arabs had fled out of their homes into neighboring lands, other areas of Palestine or other Arab states. On May 14th, 1948, the nation of Israel will declare its independence. And this guy that is reading that declaration, his name is David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion. He's the first prime minister of an independent Israel. He has been a leader of Israeli politics since the 1920s. So David Ben-Gurion is going to declare independence for Israel. This is in May of 1948. Immediately, the United States and the Soviet Union will each recognize this new nation of Israel. Anyone want to take a stab as to why the United States and the Soviet Union would immediately recognize a new nation of Israel? They're in the midst of a Cold War. Everybody's looking for friends in a Cold War, right? And much of the rest of the international community will do the same. Not the Arab states, but much of the rest of the international community will do the same. There's a lot of sympathy in the world after the realities of the Holocaust came to light. So now that Israel is a state, in May of 1948, now that Israel is a state, this war will turn from one of being a civil war to an interstate war. And on the next day, on the day after Israeli independence, those Arab League states that had opposed the development of an Israeli state, they will all attack this new nation of Israel. Egypt attacks Israel. Jordan moves in to attack Israel. Syria moves in. The Iraqis join into the fray. Lebanon fights. All of Israel's Arab neighbors launch an attack against this new Israeli state. Now, again, they're not all attacking because they feel solidarity with Palestinians. Some may. But some of these states, like Jordan and Egypt, for example, and Syria, are attacking because they hope to gain territory out of the deal. They don't want a Palestinian state. They want to grow their own states. Israel will win this war decisively. It's not an easy victory. There is some brutal combat that's happening during this fight. But Israel will achieve a decisive victory. The United Nations stays out of it. Way to go, UN. All right? You start a dumpster fire and then you just run away from the situation. The United Nations stays out of it. Again, who are the leaders of the United Nations? Remember the Security Council countries? China, USSR, United States, Britain, and France. They all have veto power over use of any military action, right? So in order for the United Nations to actually muster some troops, UN peacekeepers, to go to the region and do something, you have to have the Security Council agree to it. Are any of those countries in a position to go fight another war? No. And all of those countries, their primary concern in 1948 is what's going on in Europe. This war starts in May of 48. Anybody remember what else is going to be starting in May and June of 1948? in Europe? In Germany? In Berlin? Kind of blockadey? Yeah, it's the Berlin blockade. There's bigger fish for the Americans and the Soviets to fry in 1948. So this war is going to be an Israeli victory. All right? The Israelis are outnumbered. They're absolutely outnumbered, yet they win. And they're going to win because the Arabs don't have a strong coordinated attack against them. The Egyptians are fighting for Egyptian interests. The Jordanians are fighting for Jordanian interests. All right? Everybody, every Arab nation is fighting for their own independent interests. They don't have a coordinated attack. All right? And we would see similar things happen in history. You could compare this to the story in World War I, where the Germans and the Austrians and the Ottomans weren't too, or even in World War II, when the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese didn't really have a strong coordinated attack against the Allied powers. They were all kind of doing their own thing. And we see that in this war as well. The Israelis, I said, were outnumbered, but they were better trained. They had better military leaders. A lot of these Israelis who are leading the fight in this war were maybe soldiers in armies in Europe or officers in armies in Europe before they moved to Palestine or migrated to Palestine. They might have had previous military experience. Like some of these guys could have been even World War I veterans or officers in the First World War, giving some of their military experience. They would also get arms from outside. The Soviet Union funneled some weapons into the Israelis. And there would be underground arms shipments from the United States. The United States did not legally, we actually said, we are not taking part in this fight. That was our government position. But there would be arms smuggling from the United States into Israel. Guess what the United States had a lot of in 1947 and 48? Extra guns. We just got done with fighting a war. Now we're sitting on all this stuff. There's a lot of extra arms sitting around in America. And there's a fascinating story where in New York City, don't write this, just read about it if you care to, or look it up, where Frank Sinatra in New York City had some friends, and he was used as an intermediary to pass money from one place on to another to ultimately get arms, or money for arms, to have them shipped into Israel. So kind of a wild story there. Anyhow, the Israelis win this fight. In 1949, Israel will win this war. An armistice will be signed in January of 1949. And at the end of that armistice, this is the territory that Israel controls. They now have 75% of Palestine. So if we look back at the three maps now, this is what the Arabs were promised. The green is what the Arabs were promised back in 1937 by the Great British Peel Commission. The Arabs reject it. This is what the United Nations proposed. Obviously, that's going to be rejected, and war breaks out. And at the end of the war, now this purple here, at the end of the war, this is what Israel controls at the end of the 1948-49 war. What do we call this war? This war's got different names depending on who you're talking to. If you want to be an unbiased observer and commenter on this war, you would call it the 1948 war. Israelis, Zionists, people that are pro-Israel, would refer to this as the War for Israeli Independence. Palestinians, or people that stand against the creation of the State of Israel, refer to this war as Al-Nakba, N-A-K-B-A, which means the catastrophe. The IB will likely refer to this as the 1948 war. Okay, my standards refer to this as the 1948 war. Israel wins. They control 75% of the territory. The original plan of having the lands around Jerusalem be a separate, overseen international body, that is gone. In fact, Jerusalem is going to lie right smack dab in the middle between a line that Israel controls and now Jordan controls. There is no Palestinian state. What was originally going to be a Palestinian state? Gaza was taken over by Egypt. The Egyptian nation took over Gaza. Most of the West Bank was taken over by Jordan. There is no Palestinian state now. So the original UNSCOP partition plan of 2 states is gone. Now there's one state of Israel, and then those Palestinian regions, they're now in the hands of other nations. All right? So Israel is an independent state. Palestine as a political entity is destroyed. A majority of the Palestinians that lived within what is going to become the Israeli state, because most of the people that lived in this area are or were Palestinians, they're going to become refugees. 750,000 refugees that have to go somewhere and live somewhere. This refugee crisis still exists to this day. There are refugee camps that still exist now, almost 70 years after this war went down. All right? There are refugee camps in Jordan. There are refugee camps in the West Bank. There are refugee camps that still have the remnants of people that originally left in the 1948-49 war. Now, originally they would have looked like this, but once the refugee camps have been there for 70 years now, the tents are gone, and now there's buildings and there's homes, but ridiculously crowded and very few resources because they still have not been accepted into the countries where the refugee camps are, whether they be Jordan or Syria, or certainly they haven't gotten to return to their original homes. This refugee crisis becomes the main focal point now of the fight against an Israeli state. If the first big issue is the creation of an Israeli state in the first place, the next major issue is the refugee crisis. Palestinians argue, and international law supports, the notion of a right to return. Like, once the war is over, a refugee should have the right to return to their homes. Palestinians argue that they enjoy this, what they call the right of return. That these 750,000 Palestinians should be rightfully allowed to go back to their original homes. The problem is, in many cases, their original homes are gone. Palestinian villages were bulldozed and destroyed. Israeli settlers moved in. Those homes are now gone. Certainly after 70 years, those homes are gone. The Zionist interpretation, the Israeli interpretation of this refugee movement, is that the Zionists are not responsible for the refugee crisis. They argue that Palestine was going to be partitioned. That's what the United Nations said. Palestine was to be partitioned. There was supposed to be an Arab state and there was supposed to be a Jewish state. And what happened when the Jews made their state? Well, what happened before the Palestinians got displaced? The Zionists would argue. The Arab nations attacked. All of the Arab nations attacked and invaded and attacked this new Israeli state. And that's what created the refugee crisis. That's what the Zionists would argue. That this was not created by Israelis, that this was brought on by Arabs. The Zionist claim is that we didn't start the war, so the Arab states bear the responsibility for the refugee crisis. Now, of course, the Arabs have a different interpretation of this. They believe that the Zionists, from the first moment they stepped into Palestine, wanted this land. And that every step they took since their arrival was to conquer this territory. and that the war in 1947 and 48 was just a cover to ethnically cleanse the area from Palestinian and Arabs. This is tough. All right, and today, to this day, Palestinian right of return is still a hotly contested issue. No Arab nation has readily accepted these refugees because the existence of the refugees continues the conflict against Israel. If any Arab state were to eventually say, okay, fine, we'll take the refugees in, well, then that would take away the biggest bargaining chip against the state of Israel. If there was no refugee crisis, that would take away the biggest issue in the crisis. So the refugee camps remain. The refugee camps are going to remain. And that's going to remain the biggest sticking point in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, in the 1980s, this story is going to change. And we've talked, guys, we've talked about how history can change and the interpretation of history can change. This is historiography, right? And what are some reasons that history can change? Or our interpretation of what has happened can change? Yes, ma'am?
New information comes to light.
Very good. New information. Maybe information that was previously classified becomes declassified. Maybe new documents are found that you didn't even know existed before. What else, Mr. Warner?
The political climate can change, like what's accepted.
Very good. Political climate can change. I already mentioned Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir are going to be eventual prime ministers. Some of these most violent, right-wing, radical, revisionist Israeli Zionists from the beginning are eventually going to be leadership within Israel. But what are they also eventually going to do? What every single Israeli that was involved in the 1948 war, they're all dead now. All right? They're all gone. And as these historical figures are lost, now it becomes more politically acceptable to challenge some of the actions, right? Like, for example, in the 1980s, a historian that we've already looked at, a guy named Benny Morris, he's an Israeli historian. He started looking into some declassified documents in the 1980s. And what he found, and through his research, he found that the Zionist movement in this war absolutely did engage in the forced evacuation of Palestinian villages. They did push Palestinians out. And they did contribute to what were known as whisper campaigns. Like to have some atrocities and to talk about, hey, this could happen to your village if the Israelis come. You better leave. To get people to leave before the Israelis drove them out. Benny Morris, an Israeli historian still active today, said this actually did happen. This happened. Now, whether this was pre-planned or it was just a fact of the war once the war began, this is still hotly debated today. And Israeli historians today are starkly divided on their interpretation of these events. In Israeli historiography, we divide it between what are known as the old historians and the new historians. Now, the old historians, some of them are like literally old guys with connections to this founding. Some of them just carry the same arguments that the original Israeli interpretation had. The old historians would argue that, hey, this was just Israel defending itself. The refugee crisis was created by the Arabs, and there should be no right of return or anything like this. Whereas newer Israeli historians, some people like Benny Morris himself, not necessarily connected to individuals in the original war, might argue that Israel actually did have some responsibility in creating this refugee crisis. And so this is still hotly debated today. And a lot of it hinges on the future history of not only Israel as a nation, but eventually maybe the creation of a Palestinian state. Because the question is, if a Palestinian state is ever created, what should it look like? Should it look like this, what the United Nations originally intended? Because now, what has happened to much of this land? For example, this was to be Arab land, according to the United Nations. What do you think has happened in the last 70 years with this land? It's absolutely, it's a Jewish population now. So what happened? What would an Arab state actually look like? And the story will be made more complex as the history develops.